Thank you very much. So welcome everybody, very warm welcome to you all to this session of Innovation Week, so Melbourne Climate Futures, making an impact on climate change. So I'm an Associate Professor Ben Neville and I'm one of the Deputy Directors of Melbourne Climate Futures. I do want to begin, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet, and it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. I might also point out that as you came into this building, you may have seen some signs for the different walkways, and they tended to finish with Djering. So Tom Djering was one of them. The Djering is in the local Aboriginal language meaning together. So I think it's very fitting that Melbourne Connect has that sort of language bringing us together to try and innovate for a positive future. So Melbourne Climate Futures has been initiated by the university. We launched in March last year with the idea that the university really wants to have an impact on one of the grand challenges that we have in the world, and climate change was chosen as the first one. So bringing the resources of the university together to really have a more immediate and urgent impact on the climate crisis. And so we are both a portal into the university, so if you are wanting to connect with the university in terms of climate change, we are that portal or that shop window to help you connect into the very diverse range of expertise across the university on climate change. We're also a platform as well where we will do our own work to generate research and solutions to the problems that we have. And that includes making sure that the university itself walks its own talk. And so we've been behind the new university targets of reaching carbon neutral by 2025, including scopes 1, 2 and 3. And if you know that terminology, it's scope 3 that is really the ambitious one for the university. And so we recognise that we have a responsibility to also develop the leaders of the next generation, and so we are also supporting the Melbourne Climate Futures Academy, which is PhD researchers, and we have some in the room here with us today, so that's very exciting as well. We, as part of our grant funding, we have the CRX, so our Climate Research Accelerator grant funding, and the way that we came at this was what we described as sapling funding, right? So instead of, we have seed funding, there's sometimes a big gap, and then you might have big buckets of money. Those of you in the entrepreneurial space will know this is the valley of death. Right? And it's often when those entrepreneurs they get the original startup funding to get started, but then before they get the big millions of dollars of venture capital, they have to navigate this valley of death to get through it. It's the same for researchers at universities. Oftentimes it's somewhat easier perhaps to get the $10,000, the $20,000 of seed funding to get a project started for 1 year. But then there can also be that valley of death before the bigger buckets of money to be able to do sort of multi-year, big sort of projects that are really going to have impact at scale.
Projects die, not the people.
The projects die, not the people. Yes, thank you very much. Right, you're not falling off a cliff into a valley of death. That's exactly right. But recognising that often we already have the solutions. Often the solutions are there, and so we want to be able to tap into those potential solutions that are already being worked on, and to be able to finance and fund them and get them through so that they can potentially have impact at scale. So last year we had 8 different projects that we gave $50,000 each to sort of to get through to that next stage. So they had to have already demonstrated that someone believed in their initial idea to give them that seed funding. They had it had to be a cross-disciplinary solution. At universities like the rest of the economy, we can often operate too much in silos, and we don't sort of interact and bring perhaps the social sciences together with the hard sciences to create complex solutions to very complex problems, right? So they had to demonstrate that, and there had to be then an impact potential that we believed in too. So we have 3 teams today who are now sort of at the end of that 1 year of funding, and who will be talking to you about their projects and the impact that they've been able to have through this funding. So first to kick it off, we have Phoebe and Kat, so over to you. I'm going to take that.
Thank you everyone for coming here today. It's really exciting to be part of Innovation Week and share our project with us. So this is the final outcome of a project that has been going on for over a year, and it's called Your Climate Superpowers. Just to give some background, the idea was to work in collaboration with children and young people themselves in creating something that rescues their own wisdom and their everyday strategies to deal with climate change. So the problem that we have identified in our work at the Child and Community Wellbeing Unit, where we work with families and children and communities affected by disasters, which are becoming more severe and more frequent and appear in unexpected places due to the impact of climate change. It was a strong need to provide support not just during that immediate aftermath of disasters, but during everyday life, with climate change being an intrinsic part of our new reality, and children and young people now growing up in this new world. New world in the sense that we are now becoming more aware of it. It's been going on for quite a while. But in this context, we know children and young people are one of the groups that are the most affected by climate change, yet they often lack spaces to express their voices and raise their concerns and their demands. And even though, despite these very big, important challenges to have their voices heard, they are at the front line of climate action. But there are still very few resources that are available for them that are tailored to different ages, to different interests, needs, and contexts where children and young people live, that can help them address these everyday challenges. And not just that there's a scarcity of resources made by experts, because we are seeing an increasing number of those, is that there are very few resources that are made from the perspective of children and young people themselves, that incorporate their own perspectives, their own advice and tips, and that can also be very useful for us, researchers, policymakers, teachers, parents, to support them along this journey. So our aim was to support children and young people in sharing their own wisdom and creativity, putting them at the front stage on how do we deal with climate change individually and as a society as well, and to help inform and connect children and young people among each other, and also to fill this gap between how researchers do their work on children and young people's lives without not always necessarily involving them. So solution was to apply the frameworks and approaches that we have developed for doing participatory work with children and young people, and to also apply a strength-based framework that we have designed in previous projects to co-develop a resource with and for children and young people in the particular context of Victoria. And I'm gonna hand over to Phoebe now so she can tell you a little bit about the outcome.
Thanks, Kati. So I suppose this is kind of still in the process of what we actually did during the project, which was that we ran a series of workshops, initially 4 workshops with 4 different groups of children and young people across Victoria, and they were aged between 12 and 25. And in those workshops, we really discussed with them what they would like to see in a resource that focused on their strengths that they have and that they can develop in navigating climate change. And we also, in addition, we had extra input from 70 young people who were in Maribyrnong City Council area, and that was through a forum that a group of young people, their Youth Advisory Council at Maribyrnong, had organised for high school students in the area. So they also provided input into the resource as co-designers. And so from those processes, we identified that there were 7 key principles that were expressed by the young co-designers to be incorporated into the resource. So firstly, that it would be youth-centred and also engaging. So there was a real appetite for interactive components in whatever the resource would be. And that it would be empowering. So that links back to what Kati was saying earlier about the strengths-based approach in this project. That it should be inclusive of a diverse range of young people with different backgrounds and experiences and identities. And that the process for developing it would be participatory. Also that it would be sustainable. So the main thing that came out from that was that it should be a digital resource, because the young co-designers wanted to avoid producing waste through the process. And that also the origins of the resource should be transparent, so it should be clear who was involved in putting it together and things like that. So this is kind of the crux of the Climate Superpowers resource that we ended up putting together, and we'll take you through in a moment the website that is the final product. But I just wanted to take you through, this is kind of the framework that that structures it, and it is the strengths-based framework that Kati referred to earlier that we've used in previous research, and it's essentially, we found it useful in previous research in taking a holistic view of community wellbeing and of the strengths and resources that people in communities have. And so you can see here there's 7 different kind of elements to it. So human, social, natural, political, built, cultural and financial. And we've called them superpowers in this project, and so that was something that came out of the workshops with the young co-designers. The original framework that this comes from is called the Community Capitals Framework, and that comes from the community development field. But one of the messages that came through pretty clearly was that capitals term didn't really resonate with young people, and so we landed on superpowers as another way of understanding it, which resonated a lot better. And so the artwork that you can see here is from a wonderful artist called Tu Huong Nguyen, or Abigail, and so she's a young person herself, and that was really an integral part of the process, as well as is working with her, and drawing on what the young co-designers expressed during the workshops about their experiences of climate change, to come up with these visual interpretations of what, for example, social superpowers mean in the context of children and young people's experiences of climate change. So now maybe we'll flick to the website itself if we can. Oh no, actually that'd be good if you could flick through, Kati, thanks. Sorry, yes, I didn't give you long on the QR code, but if you scanned that, but essentially just go to climatesuperpowers.org and you'll find it. And so yeah, this is the landing page. So if you click through on what are your climate superpowers, should we do that now? It'll take you to this page where essentially you're directed to take a quiz about your interests and your strengths and how you would like to engage around climate change. This is designed for children and young people. And so you take the quiz, and yeah, there's a series of questions, but if we just flick through to the other tab where we've skipped through to the results that you get. So essentially you get told what your sort of strongest superpower is, and then you can scroll down and see the breakdown across all of the different superpowers. And then people are directed through to some secret missions that they can take on to use those superpowers in various ways around, dealing with climate change. So those missions, if we go on to them, they fall into 4 categories, and these are based on the themes that came out from the workshops as well. So there are missions for learning about climate change, self-care, everyday action, and transforming society. And so for each of them, there's, again, based on what came out of the workshops, there's a series of missions that people can choose from to take on if they're, just based on their interests and preferences. We also have an option for people to share their experiences through the website, although we're still sort of ironing out the logistics of that and how that will work, given that it is targeted at children and young people, so we just need to be very thoughtful about how we manage that process. I think that's all we wanted to show for the website for now. We can switch back to the slides. And I'll hand back over to Kati.
Thank you, Phoebe. I hope you all enjoy this little outlook, an invitation to use this website, share it with the young people, children in your lives. Maybe take a chance, do the quiz, find out which are your superpowers for dealing with climate change. We can all use that every now and then. And now handing on to the rest of our lovely panel. Thank you so much.
So, thank you very much. And so we do have just a little bit of time for 1 or 2 questions if anybody would like to pose a question. Yes, please. Can you just repeat with the microphone? Oh.
How is the website age stratified? Is it at the front page, or how does it work?
Yeah, that was a very tricky question. We explored the option of making website with different versions for different age groups. But as we work with young people between the ages of 12 to 25, we found that they had some similar interests. And at first we worked with them separately, and then we found that they actually preferred to work together at the end. So seeing that there was this interest in dialogue in between different ages, we tried to make the website suitable for anyone between 12 and 25. So there are little stories and tips that have to do with being in primary school, being in secondary school, being in university, for example. So in this case, we tried to kind of merge it together.
Wonderful. Anyone? Yes?
Hi. Yeah. Just the categories of the, let's say, the financial superpowers, and so I got interested of the bar charts. So the results. I wanted to know your findings of, like, say, the highest I recognized was the financial was pretty high. So why was that, and what is your conclusions over the results?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And we probably should have explained more clearly. So what we were showing you there was an example of someone who we'd just gone through the quiz ahead of time. So that would be an example of one person's results based on their answers to the quiz questions. So it'll be different for everyone. And we haven't, we only launched this a few days ago, so we don't have any, information yet on, the breakdown of how people are responding to that. Yeah. Kati, did you have anything to add?
Maybe we can share some of the conversations that we had with the young people and how they describe kind of their experiences. And in that sense, the impression that I got was that they placed a lot of emphasis on the social superpower. So having that skill to communicate, that's something that was very important to them in terms of developing it further. But also they had a lot of experiences talking to friends, talking to family members. And it might be counterintuitive to think, for example, that the financial superpower would be something that's relevant for young people, but the approach that we take is to tailor it to their experiences. So financial superpowers involve not just having lots of material, monetary resources to spend, but also to giving your other precious resources, which are your time and your energy, to volunteer, to contribute in different ways, and support fundraising, for example. So it will be really interesting to see what are the findings from this quiz and see where young people position themselves.
Thank you. I think every organisation needs a good treasurer. And if any of you sees an opportunity here to work with this group, perhaps if you have connections into, I can imagine secondary schools especially, but any sort of youth organisations, please come and talk to Phoebe and Kat after the session. Now, time to move on and Rod.
Thanks, Ben. Microphone here. Yes, there we go. Change of pace here. So I'm from the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences, and I guess you could call this project the Sustainable Farms, Happy People, Happy Investors project. And I think people are generally kind of familiar with the idea that many of our conventional farming practices have resulted in land degradation, impacts on water quality and biodiversity, and that regenerative farming practices are being proposed as a solution to these problems. And if they're implemented, they can improve ecosystem condition, help address climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing carbon stocks on farms, but also increasing the resilience of the farms to climate shocks and future climate change. And in doing so, we can potentially improve food quality and improve the benefits to the wider community. But adopting these practices involves risks for the farmers. We don't have a lot of evidence at the moment on the benefits, particularly, and the cost, particularly for the farm operation. And these things are difficult to factor into the farmers' investment decisions, but also borrowers and others involved in providing finance to farmers. So the need was to identify new types of finance models and the supporting elements around those that can actually help us support these kinds of practice changes in Australian farming landscapes. So, as Ben said, we've had some initial seed funding and then the accelerator funding from the Melbourne Climate Futures, and that's allowing us to develop a collaborative project with an industry partner. So the project is very much still underway, and we're in that process with the industry partner, which I'll talk about. But to set up the project, we really saw the need to have a diverse team from across the university, people from the Faculty of Vet and Ag Sciences, my school and the Faculty of Science, but also people from the finance sector, business and economics. Ben here is sharing the panel as one of the team members. And Phil Cormie, who's an honorary, long experience with finance, analysing finance options more generally, is working, and he was going to present, but his colleague Lewis Rensler is here today, and he'll speak briefly about some of the outcomes. And we're also partnering with the Central Victorian Regenerative Farmers, and our key partner in the finance sector is Rabobank, a big international, mainly European-based bank, but operates in a number of different countries in the focusing on the ag sector. So we're bringing together this understanding of both the farm system, what actually happens on farm, with an understanding of the accounting models that you might use to structure investments on farms, and linking that into different types of investment arrangements. And it's really a holistic systems approach to addressing this problem and helping to identify the drivers of value, and that can be financial value, but it can also be many other types of value in the farm system. So one of the key challenges that we identified is saying, well, what do we mean by regenerative agricultural practices? How do we define those systems? And the different parts of the farming community have very different views on whether their current systems are sustainable and regenerative as well. Then how do we understand and quantify the many different benefits that might come from those systems, and then their value to the different people involved in the activities, both the farmers themselves, the investors, and the community which are consuming or the products from farms, or they're actually kind of experiencing some of the impacts of existing farming operations in the wider catchments and our landscapes. And then how do we actually integrate these different forms of value into investment decisions? So I'm now going to hand over to Lewis to talk a bit about some of the key learnings.
Thank you. I've been involved in the research discussions in a kind of a finance sector specialist role. And I've also been working with a pilot grazing operation that's trialing regenerative agricultural practices in country Victoria. The first comment there on lessons learned to date is you saw the list of different faculties involved. So there's very much a multidisciplinary academic exercise, but there's also a number of other players, farmers, farming corporates, different types of finance institutions, insurers, agribusiness lenders, equity players. And getting a group like that on the same page is a challenge, but it's worth the effort. And I'd say that is something this has in common with other forms of innovation. There's inevitably a lot of people that have to get on the same page. The second point is really a view of value. So the research gives very clear evidence that at maturity, a property like the pilot property, which is grazing operation, once it's gone through a transition and has adopted these practices, it will have more sustainable farming system returns, and the natural capital assets of the land will be greater. The superpowers, if you like. The question is, what is involved in transitioning to that end state? What sort of financing is required, and what is the return on that investment? So from a purely financial point of view, we've got the good situation where there's benefits to the environment, benefits to natural capital assets, but also cash flow benefits. So there's a return on investment from making this transition. And the way you should be thinking about it is not looking at historical returns and EBITDA in the past, but modeling the future returns that would accrue to a mature operation that had adopted this transition successfully. So that looks at the resilience, the fact that you have less deviation in cash flows over time, the fact that the farming system itself is more productive, and the fact that you've got a very strong intangible component to anyone who wants to invest, whether it's a lender or an equity player or an individual investor, that this is something that's also good for the environment. The next point has to do with these two value chains. So there's a physical value chain which links from the soil to the consumer. And a lot of people think of this as starting with the crop or the pasture, but it actually is important critically in these practices to start with the soil. And the second value chain is essentially how it's financed. So there's a farmer and someone, a lender say, or an equity player who owns a farming corporate. But then ultimately, there's a big opportunity through such tools as securitization to extend this to an end investor. And those people who are playing with the superpowers, who are in the age group of 12 to 25, are going to be inheriting money very soon, and they're going to place a very high value on where they put their own investments. And being able to link to an end investor is going to be a very powerful way to scale regenerative agriculture. Finally, there's a couple points about enabling factors. So if the transition is worth making on any climate-related or even financial grounds, what are these risks that have to be overcome? Well, there has to be a good enabling environment. Farmers will, the one we're working with is a very experienced farmer, and he's very good, but he's not going out and doing as many soil samples as we are on this pilot project. There's a lot of data that's based in the soil that you need to start collecting in order to adopt a system that is condition-based and data-driven, which is what ultimately is going to lead to these benefits. There's a number of professional services that can help make this transition. There's forecasting, this modeling that I talked about, looking at what the return would be to someone, an agribusiness lender making greater investments in this sector, or an equity player, or an individual farmer who needs support from those financiers. There's standards in reporting, which the research is, part of the brief of the research is to look at that, how the outcomes should be reported and accounting standards should be applied. And then there's things like technical financial instrument design, one of which is a way of securitizing agribusiness lending so that end investors can buy bonds, which is good for the financier, but it's also good for the end investors, and it broadens the pool of people contributing to this. So those are a couple of the learnings.
Thanks, Lewis. So what are we doing next? We're continuing to work with Rabobank. We're going to be analysing data that they have on farm practices and exploring ways in which they might automate some of the capture of that information, so that makes it a lot easier for farmers to be able to report on the benefits of their practice change. Advice on information collection, and then how we integrate this sustainability data into farm financial accounts, property valuations, and the farmer's capacity to borrow money to fund the change. So I think I'll leave it there, Ben, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rod and Lewis also. So a little bit of time for some questions, one or two questions from the audience. I reckon that it was a split second there, just it was very close, but I'll give it to you, yes.
I might have missed it at the start, but do we have a particular time horizon we're working towards here, or?
For the project?
Yes.
So some of the initial work will be finished early next year, April next year, and the work with Rabobank. And then in that process, we're looking to develop a larger, longer-term project. There's quite a lot more that needs to be done to build all of these different elements together. So part of our kind of brief here is to develop a bigger research project that can give us that longer-term package over the next 3 to 4 years.
Great.
So just with relating to like the remotely sensed data and like a lot of the data capture you're doing, what kind of, I don't know if you can say, but like what kind of data are you looking for? Is it things like soil moisture? Is it things like, I don't know, remote assets, or like what kind of things are you looking to capture?
Yeah, there are a suite of tools actually emerging that are providing some of these services to farmers already that are using remotely sensed products to generate things like the extent of pasture cover or the pasture biomass, underlying soil conditions, water as you mentioned, or soil nutrient status. And so they're the kinds of tools we think we can use to actually automate some of the data collection. Because at the moment the bank's going out and asking questions of farmers directly, are you doing this or are you doing that? And so we're trying to explore ways in which the bank and the farmer can actually get access to some of that information to help with their decision making.
How is that? Yeah, just with a follow-up, how is that data then being aggregated and then say like benchmarked or reported on?
Well, that's one of the challenges in the benchmarking process. We need to be thinking through how we're going to do that. We haven't quite got there yet. So if you've got ideas, we're happy to
sounds like you
discuss.
might.
Sounds like you've got an interest, but yeah, sure.
Yeah. One more, sorry, and then we'll need to move on.
What, from the beginning of the project to now, what have been the feedback from the farmers themselves on what the work has done to their land and the changes they've seen?
I think there are two aspects to the farmer attitudes to this. Like I said at the beginning, some of them are very uncomfortable with the term regenerative agriculture, and they think it's a label a bit like organic agriculture that requires a bunch of specific conditions, that if they're not doing all of those things, then they're not regenerative or sustainable. But I think the better attitude is that it's of a philosophy and a set of principles that the farmers can pick and choose which ones are relevant to their circumstances. Because each farm is different in terms of its condition, past management, and how you might change practice to improve things in the future. But also each farmer is in a different stage of their life and has different capacities to actually apply some of these alternative techniques.
Yeah, great, thank you. And so if anybody else has any further questions, please go and talk to Rod or Lewis after the session. Now we'll move on to Colin.
Sorry.
No, that's right.
It's the lower one? Okay, hi everyone. My name is Colin Gallagher with the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about a project looking at the aftermath of climate change-fueled disasters. In particular, our ultimate goal is to think about the resilience of the communities affected by these disasters and how we can better understand their resilience using methods that more kind of centrally affirm the fact that disasters are collective events. So this is a project I've undertaken in collaboration with colleagues here at University of Melbourne School of Population and Global Health, as well as at Swinburne University and University of New South Wales. There's one thing I'd like you to take away from this project. It's that interdependence is really important to the idea of disasters. We're used to disaster research kind of emphasizing the traumatic aspects of disasters. So disasters are things which traumatize individuals and lead to things like PTSD, and that certainly happens, but disasters aren't just events which traumatize the individual. They're also things that happen to collectives. By their very definition, they can be thought of in terms of shared trauma, shared loss, and disruption to social systems, economic systems, technological systems. So, and we're faced with this situation in disaster-affected communities where help givers, people in our community we typically turn to for help, might themselves be in need of help. And so we're faced with this, we're presented with this kind of general view, which is a mantra in social research and disaster research more specifically, that relationships matter, you know. And that, as a general rule, that's a very good statement, but it's a broad statement, it's an abstract statement. We know that some connections for most people is typically better than not having any connections at all. But after that, we face some challenges in terms of defining, well, what kind of connections, or what's it good for, or to whom or to what should we have connections, or how many and in what structures. So what we need to think about is our methods behind what we're doing and whether those methods are appropriate to capture this interdependence. And what's important to keep in mind is that the typical statistical analyses we use actually emphasize independence, at least from a statistical standpoint. So what it is typically is the assumption that kind of has to be made in a lot of our conventional statistics is that the participants don't influence one another. So in disaster research, in a lot of research, it's about your recovery as measured by your mental health, and that's predicted by your background and your experiences and how you perceive the world. And that's, so that plays an important role in our statistical models, but it's not exactly the concept we want to capture. So interdependence, while it's this great idea conceptually, it's not, at least in our conventional models, it's not as well captured, and it can actually be a statistical nuisance if all your participants are actually influencing one another and you haven't measured that. That can be a problem. So it would be a great advance if we had methods which kind of more centrally affirm that, hey, people are in relationships with one another. They affect one another in different ways, and we can be affected not only by their behaviors, but by their background, their experiences, and how they perceive the world. And we can then zoom farther out and think about, well, what happens when a lot of people are interlocked and interdependent in this way? Can we have a bird's eye view of the network as a whole across the community and think about, well, what are the kind of larger structures that we see emerge? And where do we see different experiences of recovery in this network? So taking a look at this bird's eye view is typically something we use social network analysis for. So that's my specialty. You probably have a good intuition already for what social network analysis might be. It's a very broad field. There's a lot of different types of social network analysis. But what's important to keep in mind here is social network analysis is broad, and it's not just a way to visualize people's connections to one another. It's not just a way to record that data. We can analyze it, and we can analyze it statistically using some slightly alternative methods which actually affirm interdependence. So putting a little bit of a bookmark in that, because I don't have time to delve into it too specifically, what's our setting? The setting for this project is coming out of the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires, which, as you may remember, by many metrics is still the deadliest bushfire disaster in recorded Australian history, with hundreds of lives lost and very sudden, devastating impacts. And so the response to this academically, at least here at the University of Melbourne, was the Beyond Bushfires project, which was a mixed methods longitudinal research project looking at individual and community responses to the event. And a key part of that was, there was several different strands to it, but a key part of it was a social network component. And on top of the social survey, we actually went out and asked people, okay, who do you know? Who's your social supports? Who do you get practical assistance from? And who do you feel particularly close to? And we actually recorded names and drew a network data set. We were able to draw, come up with our network graph for analysis. But as you might imagine, in any social network research, or any social research network or not, we have patchiness, right? There's going to be missingness in any social research. But the problem is missing data is pretty darn problematic for network data, right? Because if we have missingness in some of the network, it starts changing what the rest of the network might mean. And this can come about through usual things such as refusals, resource limitations, design limitations. But again, it still has this impact on data. And an analogy might be, we can think of just as a social network as a social map, we can think about a road map, and how difficult is it to navigate a map when you're starting to miss out on roads or places within that map? So it can present similar issues. So where the Melbourne Climate Futures Accelerator Grant came into play was helping us build on this key challenge of looking at missing data. And it helped me to connect and cement a collaboration with ADAX, which is the Astronomy Data and Computing Service based at Swinburne University, who typically deals with problems that they put on supercomputers around clustering of galaxies and things of that nature. This is a little bit smaller than that. As well as the Complex Human Data Hub here in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences, actually up on the 8th floor of this building. And what they helped us to do is bring together a few different capabilities, one of which was a method for basically making a lot of educated guesses around the patchiness in the network. So we have the network, we have areas we've observed, we have areas we haven't observed. How can we use the information we have to make guesses about what we don't? And then by putting that on the high-performance computing system at Swinburne supercomputer, we were able to do that at a scale that helps us to accommodate many different forms of missingness, and to do so at a scale that starts treating entire communities. So it was a really important combination of capabilities that was only possible through the Accelerator Grant. And what that's helping us to do is think about mental health and network structure as co-evolving. So we can think about two different communities, maybe one of which, both of which had faced an initial disaster. One bounces back, perhaps in terms of its mental health and its network structure, while another might persist or remain to be vulnerable over a longer time frame. So we can get to, our aim is to think about what are the network processes, the social processes, which might help one community to recover more quickly than another. So the next steps, well, we'd like to think this is a scientifically important project. We've presented our analyses in more detail at recent international conferences. Other aspects of our analyses are still ongoing, but together they generally affirm our common sense viewpoint of both the world and disaster-affected communities as interdependent. The sum of the parts is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But a key aspect of this is how can we make the outputs from these tools a bit more useful? That's where the next step is coming up in terms of working with Natural Hazards Research Australia, as well as the Melbourne Data Analytics Platform, again, up on 7 and 8 of this building, thinking about how can we do community mapping in disaster-affected communities to answer questions such as, okay, in these communities, who's the gatekeepers? Who are the people connecting up the community? Who's influential? Who are the people who are bringing about consensus so that we can enact recovery processes? And who's isolated? Who are the types of people who maybe are at the periphery of the community? And then we can think about more general ideas of cohesive communities, communities which might be divided because they just have two different kind of factions within the community, or communities which might be more segregated according to factors such as race or class. So real brief run through, thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Colin. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Colin, how did you collect your data and what methods do you use to analyze your data?
To collect the data was a typical social survey, which was actually a bit clunky. It was a CADI-administered survey, telephone-administered survey, in which we used actually Victorian Electoral Commission rolls to actually try to get it to everybody in these communities. That was part of the reason there was more patchiness than what we'd hoped for. But what we're doing is hopefully that's going into, as part of this study, we're looking at different ways of sampling into that data. So we can actually think about, instead of random sampling or canvassing a whole community, we can actually snowball through the community. And for network data, snowballing might actually be the best method.
One more?
Your presentation reminded me a little bit about some of the discussion and the ethics of AI. In particular, the imputation component of what you're talking about. It seems to me you can only impute things on the data you have. So as a very gross example, you know, if some of those patches are people who are racially segregated or a part of town which is poorer, you can't really extrapolate from the other components. How does the model deal with that, if at all?
Good question. Kind of linking back to the prior statement, it does come down, you do have to get into these pockets of the community and get some data. So when we think about, again, this idea of snowballing as a method for sampling from networks, it is important that when you start the snowballing process, you start from a well-distributed initial seed. And we face the same problems with uptake of participation that you would in any kind of survey, but that's what we need to start with.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Colin. And so now just to finish up, we've heard from 3 very different studies, and I think it's been a great example of sort of the diversity across the university in terms of responding to the climate crisis. I I want to pose a question to you all, something that sort of threads all these projects together, and that is about your vision for your hopeful impact on the climate crisis itself. And thinking that some of the people in this audience might potentially be partners or be able to provide sort of resourcing or other sorts of assistance. So think about your vision for impact and what sort of partnerships you might be looking forward to in the future. We'll start with Phoebe and Kat. Would one of you like to respond?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I think these three projects have in common that aim of connecting people from different sectors of society, so researchers, farmers, community members, young people, children, in working together by, maximizing what everybody brings to the table. I think that's something that connects us. And personally, and also that focus on our strengths and resources, what we can apply to engage in an action, generating knowledge that is linked to action, not just theoretical. So for our project in particular, that focuses on children and young people, I would invite everyone to kind of think about when do you have those opportunities to listen to this age group. What are they going through? What are their demands? And if you're interested in disseminating this resource as one opportunity to help empower children and young people, that would be great. And in terms of our project, our next steps are to try to see if this can work as a tool, especially at schools. So we think this tool can be very valuable in a school setting, which is such an important place for young people to learn and also act on climate change. So maybe environmental groups at schools, teachers who might want to use this as a resource to work with their students, researchers, young researchers who would like to do participatory work and co-design with children and young people who would like to use this tool to engage in dialogue about climate change. That's something that we would really like to do in the near future.
I wonder also whether it really should just be limited to young people. I think all of us need to be thinking about how we can contribute to responding to this crisis, and I really like your framework in terms of identifying where we can all sort of fit into the big puzzle pieces of the puzzle that in terms of responding. Some of us might not be so identify with the visual imagery or even the sort of the superpower terminology, because we're not as much into Marvel as our kids. But nevertheless, I think it could be potentially helpful for any of us to sort of do the quiz and think about how we can contribute. So thank you very much, Rod.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think probably my vision for where we could get with this work is to change the mindset of people in the banking and finance sector about what they're actually investing in, and then in that process changing some of the tools that they're using to make investment decisions, so they are incorporating a broader sense of value in the in thinking about the returns that might come from their investment. So in doing that, I think we can have farms that are actually contributing to the kind of the emission reduction objectives that we want with climate change, increasing carbon stocks, reducing emissions on farms, particularly associated with fertilisers, some of the other chemical inputs, but also encouraging more sustainable use more broadly of land. So that's what I'd like to see.
Yeah, great. And I might mention that, so the finance industry requires a massive transformation, and it is beginning, and there is the mindset shift is beginning, but then the tools need to be developed. Just comment a little bit on Rabobank themselves in terms of their role where they see themselves as partnering here. It could be used as a competitive advantage where they might try and hold that knowledge and not share it out, whereas we need the whole industry to be transformed.
Yeah, and that's probably a challenge for innovation more broadly when we start to get into these commercial areas. Do the people who are investing in research want to just hold on to the intellectual property and keep it within their own sort of commercial domain, or are they willing to share knowledge and involve a more inclusive process that actually will stimulate a broader movement for change? And I think that's kind of one of the issues that we're dealing with in the finance sector at the moment. But we're also seeing disruptors. So Lewis mentioned, other investors, the young people who are inheriting from their parents and putting more pressure on their superannuation funds and on their potential alternative investment arrangements and things. So we're seeing this strong demand coming through different areas of the finance sector that I think can force change, and the banks have got to think about how they actually accommodate that sort of demand in either changing their own practices or working more collectively with others across the sector. Lewis wants to say something.
That we would hope would flow from this sort of research effort would be the investment in the infrastructure that you talked about. So it's obviously helping farmers make the transition, but it's establishing that infrastructure, what you need to drive the data that you were talking about in one of the questions here, to inform the farmers and the transition to support that growth.
Yeah. That's where government can have a role too in investing in the enabling factors that we talked about. That rather than a lot of the time, government wants to give grants directly to farmers and just get money out the door to them and be seen handing over checks. But the better way to drive change would be to invest in some of those enabling factors.
Thank you. And Colin?
Thanks. I guess how I view what I'm trying to do we're trying to do from an impact standpoint is just raise awareness. And not just raise awareness, but give people in communities more informed, quicker tools to make better informed and more timely decisions about what they're doing in their community around not just issues of post-disaster resilience, but resilience more generally. We can come up with these great scientific tools like network analysis and network graphs, and they can tell us great things, but oftentimes you see the potential that it could bring to an individual community in terms of informing what people there are doing in terms of their community response, or more quickly helping people coming in from outside, aid agencies, to understand a community in greater detail. And if we can just shorten the loop a little bit through some well-defined tools, some well-defined techniques that help us get these kind of mapping techniques to the communities more quickly, then it might, it just might help in the local response a bit better.
Yeah, I think, Colin, your technologies are also really important for things, in the child and youth action centres and also in the farming sector, and helping identify where there might be disconnected people from information or resources, that you can then look at how you might find influencers or people that are leaders in those particular communities, work with them to ensure that the knowledge and the tools are actually available to all the different members in the community.
And I think that the underlying principle that in times of crisis we need to hold together. We need communities to hold together and be strengthened and not be fighting over toilet paper, right? Because that will lead to the disintegration of societies. Because we know that the crises are going to be increasing. We're going to have more floods and more bushfires, etc. So we need to have those stronger communities, and at many different levels, including at the global level as well. So yeah, really, really important work. All right, I think we're now out of time. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming this afternoon. It's just this afternoon, isn't it? And for some really engaged questions. Please hang around and if you have any other questions or comments to any of the panellists, and especially if you're looking to become involved, if you think like you feel like you've got something to offer, and I reckon that over there we've got some helpful solutions. That's fantastic. So please get involved. Melbourne Climate Futures, as I mentioned, is an open door to the university in the area of climate. So please get in touch with us as well. So finally, let's please thank our panellists.